Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Sterling called her, his voice sharp as a scalpel, the words landing in the break room like shrapnel nobody else seemed to hear. She didn't flinch. She never flinched anymore. Not for 6 months, not since she'd walked through the doors of Sacred Heart Hospital in Raleigh with nothing but a sparse resume and a lie about why she needed to disappear into the night shift. He had no idea what was hiding behind those downcast eyes. Neither did the 3 residents watching her from across the emergency department. Neither did the hospital administrator who'd hired her based on a single phone call from a contact she didn't even try to trace. What they didn't know was that the quiet woman in faded scrubs who volunteered for every difficult case, who never complained, who limped slightly on her left leg, was standing next to a legend. Danielle Ross pushed through the automatic doors at 1:41 a.m., the September humidity of North Carolina hitting her face like a familiar blow. Her scrub bag hung from her shoulder, unremarkable, the fabric worn soft from hundreds of shifts. 6 months she'd been doing this. 6 months of double shifts, of asking for the sickest patients, of building a reputation as the nurse who never looked tired, never lost her composure, never asked questions about hospital policy that didn't directly affect patient care. Except she did ask about policy. She asked constantly. Every discrepancy in a chart, every notation that didn't align with the treatment timeline, every procedure that seemed medically unnecessary, she wrote it down, filed it properly, kept meticulous records that had begun to accumulate like evidence. The ER doors slid open with their characteristic hydraulic hiss. The smell hit her immediately, antiseptic layered over old coffee, the chemical sterility of a place that dealt with human suffering on a production schedule. She'd smelled worse. Much worse. The memory tried to surface, faces she'd held in desert heat, red dust that got into everything, the copper tang of blood under her fingernails, but she pressed it down the way she'd learned to press down everything. That life was over. That person didn't exist anymore. At 2:07 a.m. on a Tuesday in September, Danielle Ross was just a nurse, a quiet woman who showed up, did her job, and vanished into the darkness when her shift ended. She clocked in at the nursing station, nodded to Marcus, the ER tech who was always kind enough not to ask about the tremor in her hands when she was tired. Tonight they were steady. Tonight she was present. The charge nurse, Patricia, glanced up from the computer with relief written across her face. "Thank God you're here. We've got a full board and another ambulance coming in about 8 minutes. Vehicle collision, 2 patients. Both critical." "Understood," Danielle said. Her voice was quiet, controlled, the vocal register of someone who'd learned that silence held more power than volume ever could. "Where do you need me?" "Trauma Bay 3. They are prepping now. Dr. Sterling's already here." Of course he was. The thought moved through her without expression. Dr. Marcus Sterling, Chief of Surgery, a man who wore his credentials like armor and wielded hospital policy like a weapon. She'd noticed him watching her since week 2, his eyes tracking her movements in a way that felt deliberate, calculating. She'd learned to recognize the look of someone measuring an opponent, though she couldn't yet determine why she'd become his target. She was careful. She kept her head down. She did exactly what was asked, nothing more, nothing less. Danielle moved through the ER with practiced efficiency, her feet finding the path to Trauma Bay 3 without conscious thought. The stretcher was already there, one of the newer hydraulic models, the kind that moved with silent precision. She began her preparations, checking equipment, verifying 4 placement sites, making sure the crash cart was positioned at precise working distance. Her hands moved with muscle memory, the kind that didn't come from civilian nursing school. Muscle memory was the problem. That's what scared her most about this job, about any job. The body remembered things that the mind wanted to forget. In a crisis, when training took over and instinct replaced thought, her hands knew things that a 6-month-old nurse at Sacred Heart Hospital in Raleigh shouldn't know. When she inserted an 4 with 14-gauge precision in the middle of a code, when she anticipated a patient's deterioration 2 minutes before the vital signs confirmed it, when she knew exactly where to position herself in a trauma room so she could move in any direction without obstruction, those weren't skills you learned from a textbook. Those were skills that came from holding lives together in places where hesitation meant death. At 2:23 a.m., an ambulance siren cut through the humid darkness outside, rising and falling like a predator's cry. She didn't react outwardly, but something in her chest tightened. The sound of that siren, the approaching emergency, the adrenaline spike that came with knowing you were about to step into a crisis, it was the closest thing to feeling alive she'd experienced in 6 months. That should have worried her. It didn't. The ambulance doors slammed. Boots on pavement. The trauma team moved like they'd trained 1,000 times, because they had. A woman in her 40s, unresponsive, obvious head trauma. The EMT paramedic called out vitals in that rapid-fire shorthand that was its own language. Vitals on scene were 78/52, heart rate 128, respiratory rate 26, GCS of 8. We've got a midline pupil blown on the left. Time of incident was approximately 18 minutes ago. Danielle listened, assessed, filed every detail into the architecture of her memory. GCS of 8, that was critical, the kind of number that meant somebody was dying right in front of you if you didn't move with perfect precision. She caught Dr. Sterling's eye across the trauma bay for just a fraction of a second. He was watching her, she realized. Not the patient. Her. Like he was waiting for something specific, some tell, some crack in the careful composure she'd maintained for 6 months. She returned her attention to the patient, to the work, because the patient was the only thing that mattered in this moment. The only thing that had ever mattered. Danielle assisted with transfer, her hands knowing exactly where to grip the stretcher, how to distribute the weight, how to move a critically injured person without causing further spinal compromise. She positioned herself without being asked, her body anticipating the next step before anyone issued an order. Patricia shot her a quick look, acknowledgement of competence. Dr. Sterling's jaw tightened. He'd seen something. The question was whether he understood what he was looking at. Hours passed in that strange compressed time that happened during codes. She'd forgotten what it felt like, this sense of purpose, of being exactly where your training had prepared you to be. The woman survived. Not because of any single intervention, but because everyone in that room did their job with clinical precision. By 4:13 a.m., the patient was stabilized, sedated, intubated, and heading to ICU for monitoring and probable neurosurgery. As the team dispersed, Danielle moved to the break room during her brief window. She sat at the small table by the window where she always sat, where nobody else ever seemed to sit. Her scrub jacket hung on the back of the chair, the regulation blue of Sacred Heart Hospital, and as she bent forward to untie her sneakers, she made the small movement she made every break, her hand dipped inside her jacket lining, fingers finding the faded patch that she'd sewn there 9 years ago. Marjah. 22 by 18 millimeters of embroidered cloth, the stitching worn by 10,000 touches, edges fraying despite her care. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse Company. The symbol of a woman who no longer existed, a life that had been burned away in desert heat and came back wrong in ways that still woke her at 3 in the morning with her heart hammering and her hands shaking. She touched it once. That was the ritual. One touch, one breath, one moment of remembering that she was still alive, which meant she still had an obligation to be better than the demons. Then she let it go, straightened her jacket, and returned to the ER. Dr. Sterling was in the hallway, reviewing the trauma case file on a tablet. As Danielle approached, moving quietly like she always moved, he glanced up. His eyes were different now, sharper, focused in a way that suggested he was recalibrating something fundamental about her in his mind. "That was efficient work in there," he said, his voice carrying that edge of something beneath the compliment. Not quite mockery. "Close." "Thank you, Doctor." Danielle kept her own voice level, deferential, the tone of someone who understood hierarchy and respected it. "I'm glad the patient is stable. You seem to have good instincts for trauma cases." He set the tablet down, leaning against the wall in a way that was almost casual, except nothing about Dr. Sterling was casual. Prior experience. General nursing. Mostly medical floors before I came here. It was the story she'd prepared, the lie she'd practiced until it felt almost true. And he was listening to her words, but his eyes were somewhere else, scanning over her the way a man with experience in warfare might scan terrain. Looking for the things beneath the surface. Looking for the inconsistencies. "I'll need you on my team for the next week's surgical schedule," he said, and it wasn't a request. Early mornings, difficult cases, cases that require precision. "Of course, doctor." She didn't add anything else. Didn't volunteer. Didn't ask why. Just accepted the assignment with the quiet grace of someone who understood that this moment meant something, even if she couldn't yet articulate what. As she returned to her station, a nurse called out about incoming admission, chest pain, 68 years old, multiple risk factors. By the time Danielle was performing the intake assessment, taking vitals, inserting N4 with a 20-gauge needle through the antecubital vein in one smooth practice motion, Dr. Sterling had already moved on to other patients. But she could feel his attention, diffused but present, like a predator that had caught a scent and knew that tracking took patience. She didn't know then that those eyes were working on a calculation, that in the next 48 hours he would pull her employment file, review her sparse references, a contact at Camp Leshan who would hang up without answering questions, a hospital in Portsmouth that had no record of her application despite her resume claiming 18 months there, and begin to understand that the quiet woman on his night shift was hiding something significant. All she knew was that her hands had remembered their old precision, that for one moment in that trauma bay she'd felt something like home, and that perhaps, after all these months of running, the past was beginning to catch up. The shift ended at 7:56 a.m. She clocked out, removed her identification badge, and left Sacred Heart Hospital the same way she entered it, invisible, unremarkable, a shadow among the fluorescent lights. But something had shifted. Something had been seen. And in the distance, though she didn't know it yet, wheels were already turning. Morning rounds at Sacred Heart began at 6:41 a.m., and Dr. Sterling timed his entrance like a conductor raising the baton. Danielle was reviewing vitals at the nursing station when she heard his voice cut through the fluorescent-lit corridor, sharp, carrying, designed to be heard. "Room for 12. Nightingale here, Drew Labs at 0400. He stood at the patient's bedside, 3 residents trailing behind him like remoras behind a shark. Did our stellar night nurse actually remember to check the antibiotic levels, or was she too busy playing hero to read a basic culture report? The residents laughed. Quick, nervous sounds. The kind of laughter that isn't really laughter, it's permission. It's the sound of hierarchy asserting itself. Danielle felt the weight of the moment the way she felt chest compressions, a rhythm, a pressure, a signal that something fragile was happening. She could have stayed at the nursing station. Could have let the comment settle into the air like sediment. Instead, she walked to the room, her badge clipped to a lanyard that hung just below her collarbone. The levels were 4.2 at 0600, doctor. Her voice was steady. Factual. The voice of someone who had held a clipboard in a war zone and read coordinates to pilots. It's in the chart. She extended the patient file. Dr. Sterling took it, his fingers grabbing rather than receiving, flipped through 4 pages, and tossed it back onto the bed without acknowledgement. The chart slid across the white cotton like a playing card on felt. He turned away. The residents followed. By the time Danielle picked up the file from where it had fallen, the moment had passed. But the residents had seen her corrected him. And they had seen him not respond. That was day 1. By day 3, the cafeteria was full, 220 staff members on the afternoon shift, most of them crammed between the vending machines and the microwave that smelled perpetually of reheated fish. Danielle had found a corner table near the window overlooking the parking lot, her tray in front of her, chicken sandwich, cup of soup, a bottle of water. Small meal. Quiet meal. She ate the same thing 6 days a week. Dr. Sterling approached from her left, and she didn't notice until it was too late, until the moment he was beside her table, his trajectory slightly off, his hip angled toward the edge of her tray. It wasn't an accident. Accidents are things that happen to you. This was something done deliberately, with the precision of someone who had spent his career calculating angles and outcomes. His hip caught the tray's edge. The soup cup tipped. splattered across the tile in a spray of tomato bisque and water droplets, the sound of ceramic breaking like a single percussion strike in the suddenly quiet room. The sandwich followed. The apple. Everything on the floor in fragments. So clumsy. His voice was honey smooth. Concerned. The way you'd speak to a child who had broken something expensive. Maybe you should stick to bedpans, sweetheart. Seems more your speed. The room held its breath. 219 people stopped moving, stopped chewing, stopped existing in any meaningful way that wasn't about watching what came next. Danielle knelt. The tile was cold beneath her knees. She began gathering pieces, the apple, the sandwich, the cup fragments. Her movements were methodical. Precise. The kind of precise that comes from training, from discipline, from understanding that panic is a luxury. One tear escaped, traveling down her left cheek like a single drop of rain on a windshield. She didn't wipe it away immediately. She let it hang there for exactly 2 seconds, long enough for the front row to see it, long enough for the moment to register. Then she wiped it away without breaking her gaze from the floor, then without breaking her gaze from Dr. Sterling as she stood. Their eyes met. His were confident. Amused. Hers were the color of winter Atlantic. "I've survived worse than you, Doctor." The words came out quiet. Calm. Not a whisper, whispers are uncertain. These were words spoken with the absolute certainty of someone who meant every syllable. She set the fragment she'd gathered into the trash bin, picked up her water bottle that had miraculously survived, and walked back to the nursing station. The room didn't explode. The room didn't erupt. The room did something far more devastating. It went dead silent. 120 conversations stopped mid-word. The microwave hummed into the void. A fluorescent light above the vending machine buzzed its electrical song. Dr. Sterling stood there for 4 seconds, the exact length of a ticking clock that couldn't be unheard, then turned and walked out of the cafeteria without ordering anything. By 3:06 p.m., the story had circulated to every department. Not the tea room version where details get fuzzy. The exact version. Danielle saved a dying patient. Danielle talked back to Dr. Sterling. Danielle said something so calm and composed that someone's grandmother would have asked for it in a Christmas card. And in the telling, the bet was born. The next morning, Danielle found him in the hallway outside the medical records room. Dr. Sterling stood with 3 board members. She recognized them from the quarterly meetings, their badges hanging from lanyards that identified them as the people who made decisions about people like her. He had orchestrated this. Timed it. Planned it the way you plan a surgery, every step mapped, every variable controlled. He knocked a stack of patient files from her arms. 20 charts. 30. The stack scattered like feathers across the tile floor, papers sliding in 17 different directions. Forms that needed signatures. Notes that needed filing. The detritus of medicine that kept the system functioning. Pick that up, sweetheart. His voice carried for the board members' benefit. And try to file them correctly this time. I know complex systems aren't your strength. He turned to the board members, his shoulders relaxing into the posture of a man about to tell a joke at his own private club. I'll bet anyone here she quits within a week. $500 says she walks. He smiled. Any takers? One board member laughed. Then another. By the time Dr. Sterling had walked away, the bet had been offered 3 times, and accepted twice. $500. That was real money. That was grocery money. That was the kind of wager that gets repeated in break rooms and parking lots and phone calls home. Danielle knelt again. Gathered papers again. This time her hands didn't shake. This time there were no tears. This time, she simply picked up the files one by one, smoothed them against her thigh, and organized them in the order they were meant to be filed. The board members watched her work. She felt their eyes the way you feel pressure changes before a storm, a weight in the air, a sense of something shifting. When she finished, she stood, balanced the stack against her hip, and made eye contact with each of them in turn. 2 seconds per person. Long enough for them to see that she was still here. That she wasn't broken. That whatever game was being played, she understood the rules. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that her presence didn't already communicate. That night, she went home to her apartment, a one-bedroom on Fayetteville Street that smelled like jasmine from the neighbor's garden drifting through the window. She sat on her bed. She didn't cry. She had already used her one tear, and she was disciplined about rationing emotion the way she rationed everything else, carefully, precisely, only when it served a purpose. She opened her closet and looked at the jacket hanging in the back, the one she wore on winter shifts. Navy blue. Standard issue to anyone who worked in a hospital in January. She reached inside the lining where a patch had been carefully stitched. Faded. Worn. A unit patch from Marjah dated 20 years ago, the patch from 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, the one she had carried through every day since she'd walked away from that place. She touched it once. Then closed the closet. The next morning she showed up at 5:45 a.m., 15 minutes early. And the morning after that. And the morning after that. Day 4 came with the doors of the ER slamming open and the sound of controlled chaos flooding in like a tide. The paramedic radio crackled static and then a voice, urgent and precise, trauma incoming, ETA 2 minutes, Navy SEAL, cardiac tamponade, BP 60/40 and dropping. And everything changed. The trauma bay doors burst open and the world compressed into 12 seconds. Paramedics wheeled the stretcher with the kind of controlled urgency that meant everyone in the room already knew the math, a Navy SEAL in full tactical gear, blood soaking through his abdomen, his team flanking him like they were still in the field. For operators in multicam, rifles shouldered, their presence turning the ER into a forward operating base. The lead paramedic called out numbers that weren't numbers anymore, they were physics, BP 60/40, dropping, cardiac tamponade, 2 minutes from arrest, we've got maybe a window. The attending physician, Dr. Marcus, competent but cautious, stood frozen for exactly 2 seconds. That was the hesitation. That was the gap where people died. 2 seconds where experience met uncertainty and experience lost. The ER nurses gathered around the stretcher but nobody moved to prepare. They were waiting for direction that wasn't coming fast enough. Danielle was in the medication room when the intercom crackled the trauma alert. She heard the SEAL's tactical vest hit the stretcher rails. She heard the paramedic's voice, tight, controlled, the kind of tight that meant profound injury. She moved toward the sound without thinking, the way a piece of iron moves toward a magnet. No decision-making. Just the old algorithms in her muscle memory recognizing the signature of a dying operator. She was at the bedside in 8 seconds. Cardiac tamponade, she asked, not the attending. The paramedic. Abdominal trauma. Blood in the pericardium. We need a cardiothoracic surgeon like yesterday. The SEAL's eyes, blue, young, terrified in the way soldiers never showed terror until the moment they did, locked on hers for a half-second. In that half-second, something passed between them. Recognition. The kind that doesn't require words. He'd seen that look before, he'd followed that look into places where hesitation meant body bags. Getting him prepped, Danielle said. Not a question. A statement. She turned to the nurse beside her, Jennifer, solid, 18 months at Sacred Heart, 14-gauge angiocath. Now. And crash cart position, left anterolateral thoracotomy ready. We're not waiting for cardio. Dr. Marcus stepped forward, his voice taking on the tone of institutional authority. Let's get him to the OR, we'll evaluate there. He's coding before the elevator, Danielle said. Not loud. Quiet enough that it sounded like data rather than defiance. BP's at 55. He's got 3 minutes, maximum. The SEAL's senior officer, lieutenant commander with the kind of face that had made decisions in firefights, looked at Danielle once. Really looked. The way you look at someone whose hands you'd trust with your life. Do it, he said to Dr. Marcus. Not a request. The room shifted. Not because anyone had moved. Because someone had decided. Danielle's hands moved on their own as she gathered the pericardiocentesis kit, the muscle memory from an operating theatre in Marjah replacing the civilian training that had never quite fit right anyway. Syringe. Needle. Betadine that smelled like iodine and every combat hospital she'd ever known. The SEAL's chest heaving, his pressure dropping, his oxygen saturation falling like a stone thrown into dark water. 82, 78. 71, the monitor displaying the mathematics of a human being crossing into the territory where surgery wasn't surgical anymore. It was salvage. Hold him steady, she said. She found the xiphoid process, the landmark where all the anatomical textbooks converged with the tactical reality of keeping someone alive. Angle the needle at 45 degrees. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. The subclavian artery was milliseconds to the left. The lung was a finger width to the right. The pericardium, that sac containing blood that had no right to be there, was directly ahead. The needle went in with a slight resistance, then that familiar give, the sensation of piercing the membrane between alive and not alive. She withdrew the plunger. The syringe filled with blood. Dark. Thick. The weight of a human being's entire future pulling back through that needle. The SEAL's eyes widened, not from pain, there was no pain register, not anymore, but from the sensation of something releasing. Something giving way. The pressure that had been crushing his heart, compressing it, stealing the space it needed to work, suddenly evaporating. The monitor shifted its rhythm. BP climbed, 58 to 62 to 68. O2 saturation rising, 73 to 79 to 85. His chest expanded properly for the first time in minutes. The young SEAL's color changed from slate gray to something that contained blood again. His eyes, they found hers again and held, this time with clarity. Recognition shifting into something that looked like salvation. Sinus rhythm, one of the nurses called out. Pressure stabilizing, another. The SEAL's team didn't move, but something in their posture changed. The lieutenant commander inhaled for the first time since the stretcher rolled in. Danielle stepped back and let the room resume its civilian protocols. The attending ran through post-procedure vitals. The nurses moved with purpose now instead of panic. The tactical gear operators stood down 2 degrees, still in the room, still present, still weapons ready but no longer in the specific posture of operators watching someone die in front of them. But Dr. Sterling had seen it all from the observation window. He'd been reviewing charts when the trauma alert came through. He'd glanced up. He'd watched. He'd seen his carefully constructed narrative about Danielle Ross, the quiet, cautious nurse with sparse references and no history, shatter into pieces. He'd seen her move with the precision of someone who'd been trained in exactly this circumstance, in exactly this way, with exactly the competence that belonged to someone whose background was far deeper than any nursing school transcript. He'd seen her save a Navy SEAL's life with muscle memory. His face had darkened. Not with concern. With calculation. And with fear. By the time Danielle stepped out of the trauma bay to chart the procedure, her phone was already buzzing. An email from HR. A second email from hospital administration. A voicemail notification from a number she didn't recognize. She didn't check any of them. Not yet. She leaned against the medication room doorframe for 30 seconds, her hands absolutely steady, her breathing controlled, her face showing nothing. But Dr. Sterling was already in his office. He'd closed the door. He'd pulled up his contact list. Patricia Holloway was board chair at Sacred Heart. They'd worked together on the surgical expansion project 2 years ago. They had drinks occasionally. She owed him favors. He dialed. Patricia, it's David. We have a serious situation that requires immediate board attention. One of our ER nurses just performed a significant invasive procedure without proper attending authorization. Cardiac emergency, she claimed, but the protocol violations are extensive. I'm deeply concerned about liability exposure. I need this review before it becomes a legal matter. His voice sounded concerned. Protective. The tone of a physician watching out for institutional integrity rather than someone watching his carefully built house of fraud collapsing. The second call went to the nursing board's complaint line. A formal incident report. A third went to hospital legal. A fourth to his contact in the state's licensing office, a former resident he'd mentored years ago, someone who now worked in regulatory affairs. By 2 p.m., he'd filed 6 separate incident reports into the system. Unauthorized procedures. Insubordination. Falsifying credentials, this one carefully worded to suggest something wasn't adding up in her employment history. Creating a hostile work environment toward the attending physician. Failure to follow chain of command protocols. Practicing outside the scope of a registered nurse. Each one was crafted with enough specificity to sound credible. Each one left just enough ambiguity to raise questions that would require investigation. The kind of investigation that would take time. The kind of time he needed. By 3:19 p.m., hospital investigators had called Danielle's shift supervisor. By 4:15 p.m., they were conducting preliminary interviews with ER staff. By 5:36 p.m., the HR director had pulled her employment file and was making notes about the sparse references. One nursing school in Virginia. One clinic in Tennessee. Nothing before 8 years ago. No family contacts. No references going back further than that. Nothing. Just a nurse who appeared in the system fully formed, with a skill set that didn't quite match her background and a medical knowledge that seemed to exceed her training. Danielle received the suspension notice at 5:51 p.m. as she was clocking out. A letter from hospital administration. Standard format. Professional language. The message stripped of all subtext. Effective immediately, pending investigation into serious violations of hospital protocol and professional conduct, your access to Sacred Heart Hospital is suspended pending completion of administrative review. Do not report for scheduled shifts. Your employment status will be determined following the conclusion of this investigation. She read it once. Then read it again. Her hands were still steady. Her breathing still controlled. But something in her chest had gone quiet in the way that quiet precedes collapse. She didn't go home. She drove north on I-40, rain starting to hammer the windshield with the sound of small percussion, through Raleigh and past the urban boundary into the places where the city finally surrendered to trees. Oakwood Cemetery sat on a rise overlooking the highway, 32 acres of stones and names and the people who'd run out of time. She parked. She walked through rain that soaked through her scrubs, cotton clinging to her body, cold and heavy, until she found the grave marked Thomas Ross, beloved husband, 1978 to 2015. 7 years dead. 7 years and 2 months. She knew the exact count the way you know the exact count of things that break you into pieces. She knelt in mud that was half rain, half earth, the boundary between them completely dissolved. I failed again, she whispered. Her voice didn't shake. But her hands did. Just her hands. Everything else was locked down, but her hands trembled like they were someone else's. I tried to disappear. Tried to be nobody. Tried to just help people quietly and let someone else have the credit and be normal and be safe. And I can't even do that right. Rain mixed with tears and she let them come because the rain gave her permission. Because no one could see the difference. Because Thomas wasn't here to see it anyway. I always destroy everything, she whispered. Everything I touch, everything I try to protect, it all comes apart. I tried so hard not to be that person anymore. Thunder rolled across the cemetery like artillery rolling across a valley she'd never see again. Lightning illuminated the headstone for a single second, beloved husband, and then dark returned. She knelt there until full night came. Until the rain lessened to a persistent drizzle. Until her body temperature had dropped enough that shivering set in, the physiological response to cold that her mind couldn't control anymore. The faded unit patch from Marjah, sewn inside her scrub jacket lining for 20 years, felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The cold rain had stopped sometime in the night, but Danielle's clothes were still damp when she woke on the bench, her back against the granite marker that bore her husband's name. James Ross. 1978 to 2019. Beloved. The word felt like a lie. He'd loved her when she came home hollow from Marjah, when she couldn't sleep for 3 years, when she couldn't say his name without her voice fracturing. That was love. This, sitting suspended from her job, the only safe thing she'd built in 2 decades, this was failure wearing the same face it always had. The suspension letter had arrived at 6:13 p.m. the previous evening. She'd known it was coming the moment the ER erupted after the pericardiocentesis, the moment Dr. Sterling's face had gone the color of old bone. But knowing and reading it were different things. Protocol violations. Scope of practice exceeded. Independent action without physician authorization. The hospital was covering itself. Dr. Sterling was covering himself. And she was expendable. She drove to Sacred Heart in the grey dawn without making a conscious decision to do it. Her hand simply knew the way, had known the way for 6 months. The parking lot was already filling. Tuesday morning, surgery schedule, trauma rotation. Danielle sat in her car for 4 minutes, watching staff hurry through the automatic doors, their shoulders hunched against the October cold. She should go home. She should call a lawyer. She should let this destroy her the way Dr. Sterling had planned. Instead, she clipped on her badge, not yet revoked, and walked in. The ER charge nurse, a woman named Patricia with 17 years of experience and a low tolerance for politics, grabbed her arm the moment she passed the threshold. Thank God. We're hemorrhaging staff. 2 nurses called in with that stomach virus, and we've got an emergency admission, protected asset, high-level security clearance required. You're cleared. I need you prepping Bay 4. Danielle didn't ask questions. Questions meant thinking about the suspension letter in her apartment, the severance package sitting unsigned on her kitchen table, the way her career had evaporated in 48 hours. She just moved. The stretcher arrived at 8:34 a.m., security detail walking 3 steps ahead and 3 steps behind. The patient was sedated, restrained, protocol for high-value intelligence assets. Danielle didn't look at his face. She checked the 4 line, verified the sedation dosage, confirmed the surgical consent was properly executed. The movements were automatic, muscle memory from 6 months of night shifts and 2 decades of something older, something deeper. She was checking the monitor leads when his eyes opened. Not gradually. Not the way sedated patients sometimes half-wake. His eyes snapped open like a man surfacing from underwater, and in the fraction of a second before she could look away, he saw her face. The scream that came out of him had the pitch of a man confronting a ghost. Doria. Doria Charbonneau. His voice cracked across her combat call sign like a whip. The orderlies moved immediately, reaching for his shoulders as he thrashed against the soft restraints. Senior Chief. Senior Chief Petty Officer. Danielle's hands stopped moving. Somewhere in her chest, her heart was performing pericardiocentesis on itself, draining fluid, desperate for space to beat. The orderlies were saying things, calm down, sir, you're in a hospital, you're safe, but none of it registered because every person in the ER had heard those words in Pashto followed by her rank in perfect English. Heads turned. Dr. Sterling, present for the pre-op assessment, went pale. He looked at her the way a man looks at a sinkhole opening beneath his feet. Patricia was already moving, already making a decision that would cost her nothing. Clear the bay. Now. Danielle, you stay. Everyone else, out. I can't, Danielle started, but Patricia was already herding the staff out with the efficiency of a woman who'd been in nursing long enough to recognize a moment that mattered. The doors swung shut. The Taliban fighter, prisoner, asset, someone caught between worlds like she'd been, stopped thrashing. His eyes fixed on her face. Doria, he said, quieter now, almost reverential. You lived. After Marjah. You lived. What happened? Patricia was beside her, hand on her shoulder. Old case, Danielle said, which wasn't a lie. I was there. Long time ago. But that wasn't the worst part. 3 floors up, Petty Officer Jackson Hayes was sitting up in a hospital bed, the mobility that had returned to his chest and lungs finally allowing him to move without pain for the first time in 72 hours. A file folder sat open on his lap, restricted access, brought by his team leader, the same team leader who'd been pushing him to look at something, kept saying you need to know who saved your life. Hayes had resisted for 2 days. The seal code was compartmentalized and was not asking questions that would create liabilities. But his hands were trembling as he opened that folder at 8:39 a.m., the same moment Danielle's world was fracturing in the ER below. The photograph was from 2005. Marjah Province, Helmand District. A woman in a blood-soaked uniform, moving through fire, carrying an 8-year-old boy through smoke that looked solid enough to hold weight. The boy's chest was open, tactical triage, field amputation, and she was moving like that was normal, like carrying a bleeding child through gunfire was just another Tuesday. Her face was partially obscured by the angle, by dust, by the lens of a combat photographer documenting things that shouldn't exist. But he knew that face. Had known it for 20 years, every time he took his shirt off and saw the scar. Every time it ached in the rain. The name under the photograph read, Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross. Petty Officer Hayes's hand started shaking. His breath came shallow. His eyes, one blue, one with a slight cast from the blast that took his hearing in that ear, filled with tears that came from somewhere older than memory, from the place where the body remembers being 8 years old and burning alive. The door burst open. His team leader, Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb, moved in with 2 other SEALs, but Hayes wasn't looking at them. He was still looking at the photograph, at the woman carrying him through fire. "She's here," Hayes whispered. "The medic. She's here." Webb's jaw tightened. "Where?" "Downstairs. The nurse. The quiet one." That was the moment the real machinery started moving. Not institutional machinery, not yet. The human machinery of recognition, of old loyalties activating, of men who'd trained to move like a single organism suddenly aligned with perfect clarity. Webb looked at the file, looked at Hayes, and made a decision that would end careers. Meanwhile, Dr. Sterling was making his own decision. He moved through the corridors of Sacred Heart with purpose, his access credentials opening doors without question. The records room was on the 3rd floor, secured with a code that he'd changed himself 6 months into his tenure as Chief of Surgery. Digital systems were traceable. Paper was faster. Deniable. He opened Danielle's file. The credentials were there, BSN from UNC, RN certification, 6 months employment at Sacred Heart. Clean record until the pericardiocentesis, until everything had started coming apart. He began to remove pages, began to redate entries, began to construct a narrative where she'd falsified her degree, where her credentials were fraudulent, where the only reason she'd been hired was because of a gap in reference checking that he'd exploit before anyone could verify it. His hands were steady as he worked. Fear did that sometimes, made you operational. He was thinking 3 steps ahead, already composing the statement his lawyer would draft, already planning the press release about how Sacred Heart had been victimized by an applicant with forged documents. He didn't see the FBI agents watching through the glass partition of the records room. Didn't see the camera recording his every movement. Didn't see the moment Agent Sarah Chen made a note and whispered into her shoulder-mounted MIC, "Subject is destroying evidence. Confirm we're rolling." The confirmation came back in her earpiece, rolling. 8 months of investigation. This is the moment. Dr. Sterling sealed Danielle's falsified file back into the locked cabinet, satisfied with his work, already lighter with the fantasy of escape. He didn't know that the woman he was trying to destroy was about to walk into a room with her entire military history and documentation, with men wearing Navy uniforms whose rank insignia meant authority that transcended hospitals, transcended civilian authority, transcended everything except the truth. He didn't know that the next 4 hours would be the last hours of his career as Chief of Surgery. As a doctor at all. As anything except a man teaching CPR for minimum wage while wearing an ankle monitor. He didn't know because he was still operating in the assumption that he was the most dangerous person in this hospital. That he controlled the narrative. That a quiet nurse with a faded patch hidden in her jacket lining was something he could manage, something he could destroy. He was about to discover how completely wrong a man could be. The SEAL team leader arrived at 6:51 a.m. wearing dress blues that had never seen combat. Lieutenant Commander Webb moved through Sacred Heart's corridors like someone accustomed to rooms shifting their weight when he entered. He found Danielle in the break room, still in scrubs, hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee she hadn't touched in 2 hours. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross," he said. Not a question. A recognition. She stood. The cup fell. Coffee spread across the tile like spilled blood. Webb didn't move to help her clean it. He simply began to speak, his voice steady and formal, the way men speak when they're delivering something that matters. "Bronze Star with Valor," he said. Danielle's hand stilled. "Silver Star. First decoration. 2008, Helmand Province. You coordinated casualty evacuation under sustained fire for 43 minutes. 16 Marines. All 16 walked out." Her jaw tightened. "Silver Star. Second decoration. 2010, Farah Province. Direct action raid gone sideways. You maintained field triage in a firefight, treating 8 wounded while rounds impacted 3 meters away. 8 Marines. 8 warriors came home because you wouldn't let them quit." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in glass. "Navy Cross," Webb continued, and the room seemed to contract around his words. 2011, Marjah. The reason Petty Officer Hayes, the young SEAL in room for 12 upstairs, is alive to remember you at 8 years old. Direct action compound assault. Taliban fighters using civilian children as cover. You ran across open ground. No weapon. Just a medical kit and nerve that most people are born without. You pulled for children out of that compound. One of them was crying. One of them was praying in Pashto. One of them was bleeding from a compound fracture. Danielle's breathing had become very deliberate. That child was the son of a Taliban logistics officer. A child. Rank meant nothing. Nationality meant nothing. You saw a kid who was hurt and you ran. Webb reached into his uniform jacket and withdrew 3 pieces of metal on blue and white ribbons. He laid them on the break room table with the reverence of a priest laying holy relics on an altar. You saved his life twice, Senior Chief. Once when he was 8. Once 3 days ago in that trauma bay when every doctor in this hospital stood frozen and you moved. The door opened. 2 men in dark suits, FBI credentials catching the fluorescent light like shark fins cutting through dark water. Special Agent Marcus Chen and Special Agent Sarah Reeves. They had been watching Sacred Heart's operations for 8 months. "Dr. Richard Sterling," Chen said, and there was no warmth in it, "we're placing you under arrest for billing fraud, falsification of medical records, and attempted obstruction of federal investigation." Sterling had been standing in his office doorway. His face drained like someone pulling a plug on a bathtub. The color didn't drain fast, it drained slow, cell by cell, leaving behind something the color of old bone. "You can't, I'm chief of surgery." "I have?" "You have nothing," Reeves said, and she snapped handcuffs onto his wrists with the professional precision of someone who had done this thousands of times. "We've documented $2.3 million in phantom billing procedures over 4 years. You created fake patient files. You billed insurance for surgeries that never happened. You forged discharge summaries. And when a competent nurse started asking questions, when Danielle Ross's attention to detail threatened to expose your operation, you decided to destroy her instead of stop." Sterling's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. "You attempted to forge her employment records this morning," Chen continued, trying to create a false disciplinary history that would discredit her as a witness. "That's where you made your final mistake. That's where you crossed from white-collar fraud into active obstruction of a federal investigation." The handcuffs clicked. The sound was small but final, like a door closing on someone's life. Reeves pulled him toward the exit, and that's when the hallway began to fill. Nurses, orderlies, respiratory therapists, surgical techs, lab workers, security guards. Everyone Sacred Heart had ever employed who knew what Sterling had done, the public humiliation, the lunch tray incident, the files thrown at her feet, the whispered campaign to drive her out. They lined the hallway in absolute silence. Not one person spoke. Not a single voice. But every eye followed him, tracked his movement like predators monitoring prey. The silence was so complete you could hear the ventilation system humming through the ducts, could hear the soft wheeze of his breathing, could hear the leather of Reeves's jacket creaking as she guided him forward. Sterling couldn't maintain eye contact with any of them. He looked at the floor, at the walls, at anything but their faces. When he passed Danielle, standing in the hallway now, still in scrubs, still holding the break room door frame, he tried to look away. But her stare was the kind that pins you in place. Her eyes were the color of a winter Atlantic. Cold, immeasurable, and absolutely certain. He looked down. That was when he understood. He had spent weeks trying to break a woman who had already been broken by something far worse than him, and in that moment of understanding, the last shred of his authority turned to ash. They led him past 47 faces, 47 pairs of eyes, and he didn't meet a single one. By the time he reached the hospital's main exit, he was walking like a man half his size, shoulders curled inward, the expensive suit hanging loose. The handcuffs caught the morning light as Reeves guided him into the unmarked sedan. The door closed. The engine started. The car pulled away from Sacred Heart's emergency bay at 7:12 a.m. on a Tuesday, and not one person moved until it had turned the corner and disappeared. Patricia Holloway, the board member who had taken Sterling's first call, made one phone call of her own by 7:43 a.m. It was to resign her position, effective immediately. Her statement was brief: "I failed to recognize what was happening under my watch. I take full responsibility for not protecting our staff." She hung up before anyone could ask follow-up questions. By noon, the hospital's CEO stood in the main conference room with Danielle present, official witnesses in the room, and formally withdrew every suspension charge. Every fabricated complaint. Every inquiry into her conduct. He apologized publicly. He offered her any position in the hospital she wanted. He was careful, methodical, and absolutely thorough in his reconstruction of her reputation. Danielle asked for one thing: night shift in the ER. No promotion. No publicity. Just the work she loved, in the place where she could do it without the weight of attention. They gave her whatever she asked for. But that wasn't the end of the reckoning. 6 months later, in a community college classroom in a strip mall 40 miles from Raleigh, Dr. Richard Sterling stood in front of 12 students who were earning their CPR certification because their employers required it, not because they cared. He was wearing khakis and a polo shirt with an ankle monitor visible just above his left sock, bright orange plastic that caught the fluorescent light. His medical license was permanently revoked. His pension seized. His wife had divorced him. He earned $15.50 an hour demonstrating chest compressions on a CPR dummy, explaining to disinterested students why hand placement matters, why depth of compression matters, why it all matters when you're the only thing standing between someone and death. He had become what he had always mocked. Just a teacher. Just someone showing people how to help. Meanwhile, at the Pentagon, the sun was breaking over Arlington like a benediction. Danielle stood in dress blues she had kept pressed and ready for 19 years, the one she had never thought she would wear again. The faded Marjah patch was visible now, properly displayed on her uniform sleeve alongside 2 silver stars that caught the light like tiny mirrors. The bronze star with Valor was there too, and below them, the Navy Cross, the one that meant she had done something most people couldn't conceive of doing. The Secretary of the Navy stood beside her, an old man with silver hair and the kind of posture that comes from 40 years of command. "You never stopped serving," he said to her, and his voice carried through the ceremony hall like someone speaking into a canyon. "You changed uniforms, but you never stopped serving." You just did it quietly. That's the hardest kind of service, Senior Chief. That's the kind that requires real courage. He pinned the Distinguished Service Medal to her chest, new metal, new ribbon, same weight of meaning. In the audience sat Petty Officer Hayes, still in a wheelchair but wearing his Navy dress uniform with medals earned, his eyes fixed on the woman who had saved him twice. There were 37 other Marines present, men and women she had treated in emergency rooms across 3 different hospitals over the past 5 years. They had traveled from San Diego, from Camp Lejeune, from bases scattered across the country, because the word had spread quietly through the teams, Senior Chief was being recognized. Finally! After all these years. The entire nursing staff from Sacred Heart's ER sat in the 3rd row, still in their scrubs as a show of solidarity, because some uniforms matter regardless of the context. After the ceremony, after the handshakes and the photographs, Danielle drove to Oakwood Cemetery in Raleigh. It was 3:17 p.m. on a Wednesday, and the sun was bright and clean and full of promise. She kneeled at Tommy's grave, Thomas Michael Ross, 1978 to 2015, beloved husband, and placed her Distinguished Service Medal against the headstone, letting it catch the afternoon light. "I'm home now," she whispered to the stone and the grass and the sky that her husband would never see again. "I'm finally home." That night at 11:04 p.m., she clocked in at Sacred Heart's ER. She changed into her scrubs and carefully tucked the faded Marjah patch inside her jacket lining, the way she had done for 20 years, except now it was joined by something new, a small photograph of Tommy, smiling in his Army PT gear, sunburned and happy and alive in a way that only people who haven't yet paid the cost of service can be. At 11:51 p.m., the ambulance bay doors burst open with a Level 1 trauma, 42-year-old male, motor vehicle accident, massive head injury, pupils blown, ETA 2 minutes. The entire ER shifted into motion like a single organism, and in the center of it all was a nurse with steady hands and eyes that had seen worse and carried the weight of it without flinching. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't mention her rank or her medals. She just worked, moving with the precision of someone who had done this before in contexts most people would never imagine. Her hand started the 4. Her voice called out the vitals. Her knowledge guided the team. She was just a nurse doing her job. And she was the most dangerous person in the room, not because of what she could hurt, but because of how completely she could save. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs. If you made it to the end of this story, you already know why. Subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell, because the next story is waiting, and it might be about someone you pass every single day without knowing exactly who you're standing next to. Like this video if you believe that quiet strength is the most powerful kind. Comment below, have you ever underestimated someone only to find out they were far more than you thought?